Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. And welcome, this is TV Papua News. And in this episode we will bring you the news items of September 2019. New protest waves erupts throughout West Papua and Indonesia after racist Indonesian police go viral. Indonesian authorities claim the situation has been stabilized, although protest continues. And meanwhile, protest continues throughout West Papua. More than 60 deaths have been reported. Indigenous people of Nduga region still in refugee camps. Global solidarity protests to focus on the human rights violations. UN expresses concerns about the human rights violations. We start with the new protest waves erupting throughout West Papua and Indonesia after racist police go viral. After a video of racist Indonesian police attacking Indigenous Papuans last month in August, peaceful demonstrations have started in colonized West Papua, but also on the Indonesian islands, and against the ongoing colonization. Indonesian military has sent more than 6,000 extra armed forces to suppress the peaceful protest. In the 60 years of colonization, the army has a long list of human rights violations on the indigenous people of West Papua. The internet access has been closed or slowed down in several periods this month in order to retain the images of intimidation and brutal crackdown on the peaceful protests. Under the risk of being arrested, abused or murdered, people are still managing to send out self-made videos to international contacts. Indonesian government has a reputation of not granting international journalists access to West Papua. And when they do get access, they are being followed and intimidated. And while the peaceful protests continued, the Indonesian forces arrested the leaders of indigenous community and student organizations. People like Bukhtar Tabuni of the ULMWP, Stephen Itlai and Agus Gosai of the KMPB, or other student leaders involved in protests are still being reported as missing persons. The racism against indigenous Papuans is nothing new in Indonesia. Even in the big sport events like the national football competition, Papuan players are regularly victims of racism. And after the recent peaceful protests, the aggression and racism have been reported to intensify even. Many Papuan students have chosen to return home because of racial tensions at the universities across the Indonesian archipelago. Indonesian authorities claim that the situation has been stabilized, although the protest continues. While the protest continues throughout West Papua, Indonesian authorities have claimed that the peace has returned to West Papua. While they continue further about the development of the Papuan regions, this economic development that they're talking about has been a benefit mostly to the Indonesian immigrants, while the indigenous Papuans are effectively being excluded by this racist system. And since internet access and freedom is being regulated, international media is being denied access, these official statements is what is being repeated by foreign ministers and politicians of Western countries. And in this way, direct involvement in the ongoing colonization has already been avoided since West Papua was sold by Western elite in the 60s, in exchange of economic and military benefits. And as we are recording this news episode, the Dutch Prime Minister is visiting Indonesia to strengthen economic relations in bilateral conversations. In this visit also the Dutch National Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Safety has joined. To discuss the international relations, basic human rights has been labeled as terrorism by the Indonesian authorities. This raises concerns of the value of human rights for both Indonesia and the Netherlands. And therefore, a Dutch corporation of organizations in favor of the development of West Papua has sent this letter questioning the visit and its purposes, also informing the delegation about the recent evidences of human rights violations in West Papua. And following on the state regulation of internet and media is also the uncovering of pro-Indonesian propaganda bot systems on the social media websites of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. A BBC investigator has researched this system. It is believed to be another tool of regulating the information by the Indonesian authorities. And meanwhile, protests continue throughout West Papua. More than 60 dead have been reported. While for the outside world it may seem like peace has returned to West Papua, protests are continuing and they are becoming more violent. In protests that were set up peacefully, buildings got set on fire. And the report of local protest organizers, it stated that this was the work of hired militias in an attempt to turn the atmosphere violent. However, Indonesian authorities and Indonesian media say that the indigenous Papuans turned violent themselves. Either way, the total number of dead are now more than 60. There has been leaked images of peaceful protesters, students and even high school teens being attacked by the Indonesian armed forces. And on some of the images it can be clearly seen that Indonesian civilian militias walk among and under the protection of armed forces, attacking indigenous Papuans. And these tactics have been practiced by Indonesian military before in former situations. Now the Indonesian colonial authorities have evacuated up to 10,000 Indonesian immigrants from the Wamena region to other parts of West Papua, leaving the escalating situation between the Indonesian forces and militia against the Indonesian Papuans. And at the same time, this week radical Islamic organizations from Indonesia are calling for people to go to West Papua for a religious war. In video shows incoming Islamic groups in the capital of West Papua, Port Numbai.
Human Rights Watch warns that West Papua could be on the brink of further bloodshed as Islamic militia groups enter the Indonesian provinces with the aim of carrying out a holy war. It follows riots a fortnight ago which killed 33 people and left thousands displaced. Some fear it could turn into widespread ethnic cleansing.
In central Java, a jihadist call to arms. Similar rallies have been witnessed in other parts of Indonesia. This man says, "We are asking for the security forces' weapons. We will depart noisily. God is great." An Islamist movement calling on Muslims to carry out jihad, or a holy war, in West Papua. Some fear this mobilisation is the beginning of even worse violence. A PNG journalist writing, "The possibility that all this could turn into a widespread government-supported ethnic cleansing in the guise of a religious war is now very real." Dozens of displaced Indonesians arrived in Surabaya overnight, having escaped Papua's central highlands. The mass exodus follows deadly riots in the town of Wamena a fortnight ago. Today, Human Rights Watch calling for an independent investigation into the violence which saw 33 killed and more than 8,000 people displaced.
Their families and the public deserve to know what happened to them. Who killed them?
He says West Papua appears to be on the brink of further violence, but that the Indonesian government also has reason to prevent militia-inflicted bloodshed.
It might complicate things. It might attract international powers to talk more about human rights violation in Papua.
An intense military presence in West Papua remains. Local media reports that the military chief and several ministers were scheduled to visit Wamena today to discuss the restoration of security and stability. Virginia Langeberg, SBS World News.
Indigenous people of Nduga region still in refugee camps. In contrast with the big efforts being made to evacuate the immigrant community of Wamena, we see a serious lack of care and effort to the indigenous community of Nduga. According to a report of the aid group Solidarity Team for Nduga, more than 5,000 people have fled their region after military sweep operations of Indonesian army. For the economic development of the colony of West Papua, the Indonesian army is involved in building new high roads to the rainforest of West Papua. These rainforests will supply the demand of infrastructure from the growing exploitation corporations that are active in West Papua. This development is causing ecocide of the second largest rainforest of the world. Global solidarity protests to focus on the violations of human rights. To raise the focus on the human rights violations, the Global Solidarity Movement for a Free West Papua has organized protests around the world. With the information and images that are leaking out of West Papua, the Solidarity Movement is globally growing. Like you can see in the following images. The show Morning Star Flag of West Papua has been developed under Dutch colonial times and was part of a process of regaining self-determination from the Dutch, and has officially been installed in 1961. However, since the country has been colonized by Indonesia, the flag has been a forbidden symbol. These days, the flag is shown more and more in West Papua, but in a recent example, an indigenous woman named Mandanayan has been arrested for carrying and spreading 1,500 small West Papuan flags. She now still awaits trial and lets the people from Papua know to show and be proud of their own identity and culture. As the Western governments choose to follow the reading of the Indonesian authorities, political support from Oceania continent is growing. The states of Tuvalu, Solomon and Vanuatu have raised the situation of West Papua at the United Nations.
Likewise, our United Nations must engage with the people of Papua, West Papua, to find lasting solutions to their struggles. I want to recognize and welcome the invitation by Indonesia for a mission to West Papua by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. We must allow the participation of all people in our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals with their human rights protected. If we are to achieve Agenda 2030 and to leave no one behind.
There are violations of human rights. We condemn emphatically violations of human rights of the indigenous people of Western Papua. We we call for use of the United Nations system to find solutions to these human rights abuses. The resolution of the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum calls upon the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit the province of Western Papua to conduct an assessment based on concrete proof regarding the human rights situation. We call for this resolution, and we call upon Indonesia as a neighboring and partnering country of the region to act in a fair, just way and to authorize this mission. I would invoke the Charter of the United Nations, reaffirm our faith in basic human rights, dignity, the valor of the human person, as well as equality of men and women and of.
Also at a solidarity meeting in neighboring Papua New Guinea, politician Mr. Juva spoke out on the influence of economic interest in supporting the human rights of West Papua.
So many decades of oppression and suppression. And I'm heartened to see that for the first time we have a Prime Minister and a government which is very concerned about what is going on, and the Prime Minister has come out stating that this type of brutality and inhumanity that's taking place is not something that the PNG government sanctions and approves of and is concerned about it. This to the attention of the rest of the world and say this is totally inhumane. These are the same countries that are always preaching about democracy and humanity, and yet they are silent about this because they are willing to turn a blind eye while this type of oppression continues. Loss of lives, brutality, and racism. This was sparked by racism, an act of the terrible racism that has not gone down well with our people. They are also Pacific Islanders. We must remember this. The people of West Papua and Papua are Pacific Islanders. Predominantly Melanesians, but they also have Micronesian and Polynesians. All the Pacific Island communities that we see in our country are also represented there. The word Pacific means free and welcoming. Well, these people are not free. And they cannot be welcoming because they are oppressed and suppressed in the most brutal way. So we are responsible as people who are free, as their people, fellow Melanesians and Pacific Islanders. We are responsible for standing up and speaking out. And I want to thank the governor who has been a strong advocate of this for as long as I've known him.
UN expresses concerns about the human rights violations. The United Nations has expressed its concerns on the violations of human rights in West Papua. The High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, said her office was disturbed by escalating violence in West Papua in the past 2 weeks. Also, a panel of United Nations human rights experts have expressed support for human rights lawyer Veronica Komen. This was in response to Indonesian police naming her among the suspects of causing unrest. She's a lawyer who has been subjected to harassment and abuse online for her continuing work on alleged human rights violations in West Papua. An earlier promised UN visit to West Papua is continuously being delayed by Indonesia. This visit is meant to examine the human rights situation. Now it's still unclear when this visit will happen. The current uprising in West Papua and the violations of human rights in handling this uprising has actually renewed the call for self-determination. The people of West Papua and the global solidarity movement are calling upon the UN to follow through on the visit, and also calling for a new referendum on self-determination for West Papua. In a statement, the international lawyers for West Papua explain that Indonesia's acquisition of West Papua in 1969 remains an illegal annexation which cannot be validated by the international community, since it was a violation of the sacred trust under the UN Charter. Since the acquisition cannot be validated, West Papua is not legally a part of Indonesia's territory, but actually a non-self-governing territory under occupation. Independence for West Papua would be the restoration of Papuan sovereignty and not the violation of Indonesia's territorial integrity. This was TV Papua News for now. Until next month, we wish all of you safe travels.